Welcome to the final event in the segment of formations which is dedicated to representations of breastfeeding in literature, art and research. I'm Jenni Ramone and I run formations as part of Nottingham Trent University's Postcolonial Studies Centre activities in collaboration with the Bonington Gallery. This segment, titled Milk, explores representations of breastfeeding and relates to my own current research project. This evening, I'm delighted to be able to introduce a film screening and conversation with my colleague from the Media Production Department at Nottingham Trent University, Sue Ansell. Sue is a moving image artist who creates film and moving image installation art, which explores women's experiences, responding to theoretical and historical debates surrounding the representation of women in film, art, and media. Her work has roots in avant-garde film and art practice, and tonight she's making her film Breastwork available for formations audiences, and she'll be talking to me about the film beforehand. This interview will be about half an hour long, and we're delighted that you can join us. After the interview, you can access the film using the separate link and password that you've received with your ticket. The film will be available for you to watch using this link and password until Monday, so that you can watch it over the weekend. Please don't share the link and password or make any copies of the film in order to protect the integrity of the work and to protect the women who took part in the project. But feel free to get in touch with us if you have any responses at formations@ntu.ac.uk. Welcome, Sue, and thank you very much for being here and for sharing your work through formations.
Hi, Jenni, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you, and I'm really looking forward to being able to watch the film again, which I've already seen once. I wondered if you could start by telling me about how you made the film. Perhaps you'd like to talk about what inspired it and about the links it has to breastfeeding.
Okay. Yes, I mean, it's a little while ago now, because it was when my children were quite young and they're teenagers now. But I had, I suppose, I'd just begun a job where I was commuting and had lots of encounters along the way with what I would term pornography in cafes, bookshops, on the train. And my job was lecturing in the university, and I felt I wanted to explore this further with research and practice. And I'd just finished making a short film which did have a scene in it that was a woman breastfeeding, back actually in the 18th century. So it was it was sort of a period piece. But and I myself had lots of sort of experiences with breastfeeding that were I felt sort of an unusual kind of breastfeeder in that I wasn't able really to do it in public. All around that time as well, there were issues within the media about women being thrown out of cafes and shops for breastfeeding in public. There were sort of actions and so on. But initially, the first thing that I wanted to do was to make a piece of work that would work around having young children and commuting and doing a full-time job. So I had much earlier taken a snap of some wallpaper in a hotel when I was, or I had just finished breastfeeding and my son was 1. And the shape of the sort of garlands of flowers in this wallpaper did, to me, resemble breasts. And I don't know whether it was just that I was just fairly obsessed with breastfeeding at that moment in time, because I'd just sort of finished it, and it was a sort of quite a moment when that happened. But also then kind of encountering this situation a few years later where I was commuting and seeing this pornography that was about the head height of children in the stores on the shelves, made me remember this snap that I'd taken in the hotel. And I sort of put the two things together. It kind of felt like I could do something with women in their homes, in my home, that fitted around all those elements, the the fact that I was working and having young children. So.
Lovely. So maybe you could talk about the practical production process. So maybe how you found the participants, how you actually created the film with them.
Yeah, so once I'd had this idea, it was sort of, oh, who am I going to get involved then? And first of all, I did some test filming on myself. I mean, I'd had many years of filmmaking experience, so this was sort of a natural way for me to express the idea, was to get a camera and start doing some filming. And I work in quite an intuitive way, so I'll do some test work and see what comes out, and then sort of almost start a dialogue with the work. I always, in my head, carry around an image, and I guess it was that image of that wallpaper as well that was sort of in the back of my mind. So I did some tests with myself at home, and then spoke to a colleague at work who was a photographer, and she said, oh, I'll do it, and it really just started a conversation that then went on for about 4 years over time, with different women at different times telling people about the project, and women having their own stories and wanting to get involved for a whole host of reasons, to do with questioning things about their body, maybe things going on in their lives, experiences they'd had, and their own views about the representation of women and women's bodies.
And so you said you did this project in your own home and in other women's homes.
Yes.
And so did you film in both places, or did you invite women to your homes to be filmed, your home to be filmed?
It was in both places. It actually started out, I did the first one in a studio at work, because that was a space opposite to, and it was almost like a meditation and an exploration. And I then I'm in a choir, or I was in a choir that we haven't been able to operate over the last 18 months, but of women. It's a women's choir. There are about 40 women involved. And so I spoke to some of them about the project, and they were very interested. So sometimes I would invite them to my home and I would visit them. Then they also wanted to get their relatives involved, so mothers, sisters, aunts, who, so it sort of spread like ripples in a lake, it kind of grew quite organically.
It sounds as though when you were in the process of creating this film, then you had loads of really positive responses from people when you talked about the project, people who wanted to get involved. So I imagine you anticipated that the responses that you would get to the finished project would be just as positive. But I know you've talked before about how there were some surprises in the way that you had responses from people who had invited you to exhibit your work at conferences and to present it at galleries, that sometimes those people found it quite controversial, which must have been a bit of a contrast from this experience of having such a kind of a ripple effect of positivity and
yeah, I would say on the whole, it has been well received in terms of even, in the pilot stage, it was exhibited at a conference. In fact, one of the women involved was organising a conference, and she said, come and show it at this conference, even though it was just a small work at a pilot stage then, and only a handful of women had been filmed, and I'd just begun the edit. So it was sort of a focal point. And it was shown in it's not exactly a canteen, but where everybody was having their coffee breaks and stuff. And we had a big whiteboard next to the work for people to write comments and stuff. And that was really positive. It was later when I started, I'd written a paper about the work and edited it to a much greater extent, and took it to a conference in Berlin, which was a great conference all about the image, and it was sort of social representations of the image that I was talking about and that the conference was about. But there was some nervousness about me screening the work in the foyer. My initial intention for the work was to screen it in waiting rooms because of the whole link with the commute, and I had applied to Art Angel to have try to get funding to have it in railway stations from Nottingham to London, all along the route. And although that was unsuccessful, it kind of helped to sort of focus the work and what the purpose of it was. And so I wanted it to appear in those kinds of places, and it did work in the previous conference. And yes, the organisers were very nervous about it, and although they would allow me to screen it in the actual conference itself, they were very reluctant to put it in the foyer, to say the least. And in the end, after much debate, said, well, you can show it on your laptop in the corner. That's what I did. I just turned the music up really loudly and hoped it would draw people's attention. But yeah, it was very strange because, you know, of the nature of the conference was all about debating, you know, how the image can affect change. And another one that I submitted it to, the women who organised the conference were really supportive. And again, I screened it in a main cinema, which was a huge screen. To a select audience, but it had originally been planned to screen it on a video wall that was a purpose-made video wall screen in the cafe area of a cinema, an art house cinema as well, not a mainstream cinema. And the tech people were great. They were like, yes, this can be done. It's going to be great. Da, da, da. And the marketing woman who was responsible for marketing said she was too nervous about children seeing it, which was quite a shock to me. And I did explain, you know, it's not a sexual work. The whole idea is that it's kind of questioning the nature of sexualization of women's bodies in all sorts of contexts, and you know, and children have seen more breasts than you can imagine. Anyway, so I should have given that, you know, breastfeeding is the way many children start out in the world. So it was quite strange to me that, and I think it's a misplaced embarrassment and worry about people, you know, criticizing and making legal claims, and you know, it's just the sort of world we inhabit now, isn't it? That they didn't want to cause any sort of controversy, but it was an imagined controversy. I don't think there really would have been one. And it could, you know, I could have done a cut that was a bit more appropriate so that you didn't see so much detail. You know, I did offer that, in fact, but no. So it was screened screened in the main cinema in the same building. It was screened in the canteen area of the conference, and it was screened in a small sort of kind of little conference theatre, which was nice. It got more screenings as a result. So,
yeah.
So the upshot was good. But on the whole, as I say, those are sort of small, kind of, in a way, it's grist to the mill, because I just think, well, there is a question and a debate to be had, you know, and certainly when I was creating the work, there were all sorts of debates going on in the media about, as I say, about women breastfeeding, but also about page 3 at the time, which sounds like very anachronistic now, but that was raging for years and years and years. And, you know, it had come to a head, really, because the supermarkets were getting involved, and, you know, there was the whole debate about whether they should be brown jacketed, the magazine covers and things like that. And I mean, it all seems a bit sort of antiquated now, but the issues have just gone online now. That's a whole other debate, but
yeah. Hearing you talk about it, people who haven't seen the film might imagine that it's a straightforward representation of breastfeeding, but it isn't. And actually, if you came to the film without even knowing anything about breastfeeding, you might not notice breastfeeding so much. It might be, you know, because it's quite an artistic representation. It's not straightforward. But I wonder if you had a particular message that you wanted to convey, or something that you wanted to achieve with your work in relation to breastfeeding specifically, rather than the wider debates about women's breasts, sexuality and feeding and infant feeding, and the ways in which sexuality and infant feeding might be brought together problematically or incorrectly. Thinking about the element of your work that's kind of about breastfeeding, what would you like to achieve with this, if it could achieve something?
Well, it's funny, Jenny, because at the time that the sort of inception of the project, it was the time when there were suddenly a lot of large screens in public places. So, you know, railway stations, advertising hoardings had become those rolling kind of advertising. And also, I think there must have been money around to just put lots of screens in cities outside. And I had the idea at the time of doing a live breastfeeding on those screens and just networking them up. So it was an idea that never sort of, I didn't ever go anywhere with in the end, shame. But I suppose in a way this kind of came out of those sort of considerations. The one word that keeps coming back into my mind is about ownership. Who owns women's bodies? Who owns imagery of women's bodies? How does that ownership, you know, is it traded in lots of ways? So, and I think the conversations that have happened around the work have kind of borne that out, really, that they always come back to that issue. And breastfeeding is such a visceral kind of expression of that sort of debate around ownership, because there couldn't be anything more natural and more in the domain of that woman and her child, and yet there are so many claims to that, to the image of it, to the where it should happen. I mean, there were even ridiculous things about, you know, creating. John Lewis created a sort of cloth that was made to look like wallpaper, so you could put it over the baby and pretend the baby wasn't there, which is kind of really quite, you know, that's just a sort of really, but all those little detailed examples add up to a much wider attitude within society. It varies a little bit, I guess, globally, but I think we're one of the most prudish societies in a way in the UK, with those kind of issues, you know, around the body and sexuality and sensuality and women and breastfeeding. So I don't know if that answers your question enough about breastfeeding.
I think it opens up another really interesting line of inquiry to do with ownership, as you say. It's just, I'm thinking of loads of things that we could talk about for hours about ownership and in relation to breastfeeding, even just at the simplest level, whether the woman or the child owns that breast and the milk within it and the experience. But yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think that would be a really nice way perhaps for people to think about focusing their attention to breastfeeding when they're watching your film. So I think that would be a lovely way for people to something for them to keep in mind and see what the film says to them about ownership. Maybe it'd be nice if people would respond and let us know their thoughts on that. So before we move to the film, I just wanted to ask whether you have any further plans for this work, what kind of an afterlife you think it might have. Obviously, it's been shown a number of times, and recently it's been shown a couple of times as well in these kinds of academic contexts and, well, academic and public contexts. Do you have any further plans for this work? And perhaps you could also talk to us about any plans you have for new work.
Thank you. It always feels to me like it's an unfinished work. It doesn't seem it when you watch it. It's a finished edit, and but my intention for it was to go further in terms of particularly the soundtrack. Many women told their stories when they were sitting or standing for the project, and doing the choreographed hand movement. It almost became like a meditation, and it kind of had its own rhythm about it. So I think it would be nice to take that further. There was filming that I didn't use, and I would like to use, and filming that carried on after that edit was made. And so I would like to make another work, but also exhibit it in different ways. So the other thing that I think I've spoken to you about before was that I have a packet of my own breast milk in the freezer from from 16 years ago, which might sound a bit strange to some people, but I did intend to do a piece of work with that. And my son being 16 this year, I've sort of tentatively asked him whether he would help me to do that. And in a way, in a sense of letting go of his babyhood finally at the age of 16, you know, that he is growing up, and some way we can represent that with the breast milk and sort of say goodbye to it in a sort of very visualized way. So I'd like to make a piece of work around that. Moving away slightly from that and to the new piece of work that's sort of preoccupying me at the moment is called Swan Song, and that's about well, it was instigated by the loss of my mother and discovery of a tape that I had of an interview I did with her right at the very start of when I started making films. She happened to be the age in that interview that I was when she died. So there was this sort of cyclical thing. It also it's about loss, transcendence, separation, not just from a parent, but also I happened to have separated from my husband. So I moved into a new house that was near some swans that were giving birth at the time that I arrived. So there's and then the lockdown happened. So there's a lot about sort of collective loss as well there, and there's an ecology, and so it's got lots of layers of themes within it. But the symbolism is around swans, this interview, the blue light of ambulances which flash past my house all the time, and so I want to do blue swans basically in this project. So it's going to be perhaps an installation work, perhaps some sort of filmic work anyway, but it will evolve over time. So yes, watch this space.
Fascinating as well. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about it as the project progresses too. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for sharing your film with our Formations audience. I'm sure it will be something that will captivate their attention, and we're really grateful for you for making this available for our audience. So thank you again. Okay. It's been wonderful to have you. Thank you, Sue Ansell, and thank you to our Formations audience.
Thank you. Thank you.